malicious, and that their designs on the world have to be checked. And if they're not, then they will only grow, and that would be a great danger. That's number one. Number two, Americans are a good people, but we often don't see threats for what they are. It took a while after World War II to see the threat of the Soviet Union. As vicious as the Soviet Union was in the treatment of its own people and in the Eastern Bloc. It took Americans explaining over the better part of a decade or more to get the rest of their countrymen to understand that the Soviet Union was in fact a threat. We expect that same kind of work needs to be done at a much grander scale here in the United States to get our countrymen to understand everything that is wrong and dangerous about communist China. The third thing is we Americans have a lot to do when it comes to commerce and free trade. And when it comes to business, we're very often outward looking. We see opportunities when it comes to business, but we don't see the malfeasance of individual countries who are doing bad things. And so you who are on this call today, who are from other countries, who are engaged yourself with communist China, you need to know that we are sympathetic. We are on your side. We are people who believe in human freedom ourselves, but also want freedom for other people, if that is at all possible. And so we have done a lot to take that understanding and, as I say previously, explain that to other Americans. But that is a job that will take much more work. You adding your voice to what we do is, I think, a very important thing, because together we can lay out the case for why not only we must defend the United States, but why also we need to look to the peoples around the world who are being exposed and abused and otherwise, in some cases, unfortunately, enslaved by communist China, and why we need to stand up to them, why we need to be strong economically and militarily to do so, and that why we have to then spread that knowledge to other peoples in the hopes that they too can become free. We are also realistic about this. We know that this is not an easy thing, but that together we can build a free world so that all men can enjoy the freedom and liberty that Americans today enjoy. So I hope in our conversation we are realistic about the threat, but also optimistic about what we together can do to help both we here in America understand the problem, but also peoples around the world to understand what is also possible to achieve freedom themselves. So with that, let me thank you for joining us today. Thank Frank Gaffney and Dee Dee Lageson and Saban Kim for all their hard work in putting this together. And so I look forward to our conversation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We have two individuals we're going to hear from next, both based here in the United States, who are working very diligently in their respective capacities to try, to actually bring some of the capabilities that Brian just alluded to, the power of the United States, particularly the financial resources of the United States, to bear, to try to help in the liberation of enslaved peoples and to assist those who seek to remain free of the Chinese Communist Party to do so. The first is Roger Robinson. Roger is the president of RWR Advisory Group, which has been doing amazing work describing and exposing for many of us what the Chinese Communist Party has been able to do to underwrite its malevolent activities at home and abroad by tapping into the resources of our capital markets. Roger formally, some time ago now, also worked for President Ronald Reagan as the Senior Director for International Economic Affairs on the National Security Council at a moment when President Reagan was taking down the last totalitarian communist regime that posed an existential threat to freedom, the Soviet Union. He played an instrumental role in that, even as he is now playing an instrumental role in dealing with our times. Great threat. Roger Robinson, the floor is yours. We're not hearing you, Roger. You need to unmute.
There we are. My apologies. Let me start again. I'm delighted to be joining you tonight, and I'm very grateful to the organizers and Frank and Dee Dee. This is a terrific gathering. I want to stay within my time limit, of which I'm calculating at about 6 or 7 minutes. So if I may, I'll get right to it. The United States dominates the economic and financial domain on this planet. We have over 60% of the world's liquidity. Our capital markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. We have the world's reserve currency that settles some 95% of global transactions on a daily basis. China has a non-convertible currency, much like the Soviet Union did. And they have a desperate need for dollar financing. You hear a lot about their reserves, you hear a lot about their apparent endless liquidity. That's exaggerated and I think largely false. They have been tapping into our markets for the last 25 years on a preferential basis with no screening, no diligence of any kind, no compliance with federal securities laws, no screening of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, looking for sanctioned companies, looking for PLA advanced weapons manufacturers, looking for those that are engaged or enabling of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, concentration camps, etc. The point is there's never been a hard look at the national security and human rights dimensions of these companies that are largely state-owned and certainly all state-controlled. And as a consequence, we found ourselves moving trillions of dollars of funds under management to the Chinese in the form of both equity and debt, that is stocks and bond offerings, and simply the ability to trade in our markets. Now, this is a scandalous situation. It is very ironic indeed that we've concentrated on trade appropriately, the tariffs, we've concentrated on technology and understanding the dangers there. But isn't it interesting that the money, which is the fundamental aspect of the whole show, never came up? Not one NGO meeting before March of 2019, not one interagency meeting, not one congressional letter, not one congressional hearing, not one cocktail conversation among policymakers in 20 to 25 years. Not one. Now think about that for a moment. This is China's single greatest vulnerability. I would argue it's our single greatest strength. We have a lot of strengths. Our military might should speak to you, but when it comes to the economic and financial domain where the Chinese live or die, and we want to end this thing like we did with the Soviet Union without a shot fired, this is the domain to look to. And big surprise, like the Soviets before them, it gets down to the money. Now, we're working to fix a very serious problem here. And it's not going to be easy to address it much more in the 3 minutes remaining, except to say that we have labored hard on the research side in identifying all forms of bad actors, corporate bad actors, human rights abusers, national security dangers, as well as those companies that are offering no investor protection for Americans, no disclosure of their financials, no audits of their books. It's just as they say, a free lunch program that hasn't quit. So we have a huge undertaking ahead of us to correct this situation and to make clear that the American people, there's 170 or so million Americans whose retirement accounts and investment portfolios are being ransacked by Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party companies, and looking for funding, not just the theft of technology, intellectual property, and all the ills we already know. So I would just leave you in with the idea here that, for my taste, this is the biggest game in town. This is where this implicates $60 trillion of funds under management. The Chinese position is indefensible. The preferential treatment and the free lunch that we've accorded them is indefensible. We have a very strong case to make, including even U.S. sanctioned companies are being rewarded with funding and access to all forms of financing. So I will just leave you with that outrage to reflect on and assure you that we will spend every waking hour putting the Klieg lights on these outrages until they are remedied. And I'll leave it there, Frank, for now.
Roger, thank you very much. Let me just say that we're going to take a short break in a moment for questions. If you have any, please communicate them through the chat room, I believe is the way to do that. Didi Augustin and Lydia Blaha will help us make sure that we get them for presentation to our team. Next up, I believe we've got Rick Manning. Is Rick in the program?
I am.
You are. Splendid. Rick is a former senior official in the Labor Department of the United States, who is currently the president of Americans for Limited Government. He's also a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and has become, in the past 2 months or so, the campaign director for a very important initiative the committee is very pleased to support and sponsor, Divest China Now. Rick, we're very anxious to have you add to our conversation here by telling us about that initiative and how people can find out more about it.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. You know, divestchinanow.org, it's pretty obvious how to find out about it. Go to divestchinanow.org. So I'll repeat that a few times because I really hope people will go.
Turn on your camera, please.
Pardon? Did you cap, Rick, please?
Is my camera on?
You need to turn it on. It should be up in the upper right-hand corner.
Okay.
Yes, webcam, share my webcam.
Okay, webcams. Share my webcam. It says I am sharing my webcam.
All right, well then just press on, Rick. Maybe it'll turn up.
Let me go. Yeah, I can see you. Okay, it's probably better that you can't see me. So I'm really doing you all a favor. Technologically, the webinar people are done you all a favor. So let's talk about what's real. What's real is that that right now the Department of Labor allows for retirement funds, private retirement funds, to be invested in Chinese assets. They do so even though the Chinese assets are not transparent. They are, and as a result, are actually, it's against the law for them, for private retirement assets, to be invested in Chinese assets. We have been engaged in a dialogue with the Department of Labor related to this. That's pretty aggressive, and I'm going to focus on this one thing because a lot of other things flow from it. We've been engaged in a dialogue with the Department of Labor about this and how they need to take action to divest, to create the divestment of U.S. retirement assets directly into China. Why that matters is because the U.S. retirement assets, which are a huge chunk of money, trillions upon trillions of dollars, are not allowed to be invested in China. What Wall Street will have to do is they'll have to create emerging market funds that don't include Chinese assets, opening up a vast number of opportunities for people to choose not to invest other assets into China, and really rip the guts out of the capitalization of China by the average American citizen simply by giving them an option to not invest in China. Now, some people may say that this is a little bit of a challenge, and it is. But once again, going to divestchinanow.org will allow you to have the opportunity to let the Department of Labor know that you want this done. Let me read you something that the Department of Labor sent out today. Eugene Scalia sent it out today. And I think this will give you some hope. It's recognizing International Religious Freedom Day. This is from the Department of Labor. Today's commemoration of International Religious Freedom Day reminds us that Americans can be deeply grateful to live in a nation where religious freedom is rooted in our founding ideals and protected by the law of the land. Today is also a reminder that many people around the globe who do not enjoy the freedom to practice their faith but face persecution for their religious beliefs. We particularly recognize the Uyghur Muslims and other religious and ethnic minorities in China who have been forced into state-sponsored labor and re-education camps by the Chinese Communist Party. Last month, the Department of Labor took steps to combat these exploitative labor practices by releasing its biennial list of goods produced under conditions of forced labor. China topped the list at 17 goods, or more than any other country. So, the guy who we need to divest U.S. retirement assets from China just wrote the reason why they need to divest retirement assets from China. And he will find out tomorrow that I truly appreciate him doing so. And I would hope that everybody on this call would go to the divestchinanow.org website and because it's going to go to Scalia, and send him a direct note, thanking him for his support and urging him to take action to make it so U.S. retirement funds and no funds under the control of the Department of Labor are invested in Chinese assets that are both immoral and dangerous investments. I think that this is a kind of a watershed thing because Gene Scalia has, in fact, agreed with our premise and supported our premise in this statement. And he's been under somewhat intense pressure the last 3 months to take action. Something that also occurred within last week is Senator Kelly Loeffler from Georgia wrote a letter to Eugene Scalia urging the divestment of funds from China. And why that's significant is she's the most prominent financial services equipped person in the Senate. In fact, her family owns the New York Stock Exchange. So by having her weighing into Scalia saying that it's inappropriate for American retirement funds to be invested in Chinese investments, and she makes it a little more narrow than I do, but nonetheless, she's making our point for us, and she's the single most credible person in the Senate to make that point to Scalia. So there's a lot to be hopeful about. There's a lot of progress being made. And the fact of the matter is, folks, with you guys, praising Senator Loeffler and giving her thanks, and going to Scalia and urging him to take action, words are not enough, actions are needed. By doing those two things, we can make a huge impact in the very near term in terms of cutting off a large quantity of capital flows to go directly to China from people who don't even realize it's happening. That's what we're doing. We're focused on a lot of other things as well, but that's the thing we can get some immediate traction on, and I would encourage you all to take action and just go to divestchinanow.org, and it's got a lot of resources for you. But the main one is get to Scalia, tell your story, and make certain that he knows that there's a moral component to this that cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Rick, thank you very much for your leadership on this campaign and for the hopeful news you've imparted, as has Roger. We have a few minutes for questions. I am seeing one from the audience, but let me just ask it one of my own. And maybe, Roger, you might just amplify on a point that Rick has just made, namely the interest being expressed by elected members of the United States Senate in this initiative. And I'm thinking specifically of something that was unveiled just today by Senator Marco Rubio. Would you talk a little bit about that and its implications as a legislative initiative as well?
Yes, there's been strong bipartisan support for remedial action on the capital markets vis-a-vis China. Unanimous legislation was passed on trying, for example, to delist Chinese companies that are not compliant with PCAOB audits, as they're called, the government auditing function. And there are other examples going back to the thrift savings plan, where we defeated an effort to insert bad actor Chinese companies into the investment portfolios of every federal employee and member of our military that had exposure to any kind of international portfolio. That said, Rubio today introduced legislation. I should have it in front of me with the title, but leave it to say that it's about the American capital market security. And it makes the point, one of the points that I very briefly touched on earlier, that even U.S. sanctioned companies are littering the investment portfolios of scores of millions of unwitting Americans. Now, Rubio is acutely aware of this. We've been in touch with him since the summer of 2018 on this subject continuously. And we did have a meeting of the minds in terms of two forms of sanctions that we have outstanding: the Commerce Department entity list, which you've heard about, as well as this newer Pentagon PLA list, where they are going public with Chinese military companies that pose a danger to the United States. He took both of these lists and added capital markets penalties, teeth, if you will, by stating that if, we had a situation where we were penalizing these companies for national security and human rights abuses on the one hand, and allowing them to stay in our markets and be funded and financed and traded in our capital markets simultaneously. So here we're funding them, while on the trade side we're penalizing them. There was no consistency at all to this, a glaring gap. Well, he sought to fill this by suggesting that if you're now henceforth on the entity list, the blacklist of commerce, if you are ending up on the Pentagon PLA list, that's it for you in the U.S. capital markets. You're out, you're deregistered, you're delisted, and it is against the law or individual to invest in those companies, including their subsidiaries and their overseas presence. That is this gambit, which is the most favorite of China today, which is to take, and Wall Street, which is in league with them, they take companies from Shenzhen, Shanghai, Hong Kong, they put them into indexes, just add them, hundreds of them at a time. Those are in turn, they build investable vehicles around them called exchange-traded funds, which many of you are familiar with. And they benchmark, as it's called, they mirror those indexes. And they end up in the portfolios of those scores of millions of unwitting Americans I talked about. And they're unregulated. There's no vetting, there's no diligence, there's no compliance with securities laws, there's no material risk disclosure of SEC variety. And he's basically saying, oh, no, 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 no. This unguarded back door into our markets, watching trillions move, that's over. So this is one of the most important legislative developments in history. There's never been capital markets penalties associated with American sanctions, to my knowledge. Even in Iran, you can't find, in my opinion, a precedent for what happened today. And I would just urge you to pay attention to it and look at it. There's a Reuters piece on it, and this is just the beginning.
Well, and I think to the point of what we all can do about this threat from the Chinese Communist Party, supporting legislation along these lines from Senator Rubio is one very, very important initiative. Brian Kennedy, let me ask you quickly, if I could. There are several other important steps that the Trump administration has taken to date that indicate that they, too, appreciate the importance of the work we've just been discussing. Might you mention what the director of the National Economic Council and the National Security Advisor to the President, respectively Lawrence Kudlow and Robert O'Brien, have been saying to the investor community in several communications in recent months?
Yes, I think that's very important, Frank. Both the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor were warning the retirement funds of the United States that they ought not to be investing the retirement funds in corporations that are doing business in communist China, that they were both a risky investment simply because they were themselves subject to a lot of reputational blowback, but that it was, in a way, morally wrong, too, for American corporations to be investing, to be doing business in these Chinese corporations, and also wrong to be actually taking someone's hard-earned retirement money and putting it in a Chinese company, because in doing so, they were betting on the success, practically speaking, of communist China, which no one would knowingly want to do. But I would say to you, Frank, and to Roger, it does really raise the question and the problem of why are Americans thinking this way? Why is it that an American investment bank would be thinking about taking American dollars and investing them in the success of communist China, given everything communist China is doing today? And that really, I think, is one of our real problems here in this country, that a certain class of American has become corrupt when and really inured to the problems of human rights abuses and the threat that communist China presents to America more directly. And I think part of the purpose of this conversation should be to really get at how can Americans ever get to the point where they're investing in the success of a totalitarian regime. And it can't just be money. It has to be something bigger than that. And that's really the kind of thing we want to expose.
Brian, this is a perfect segue to a question from our audience. The issue, and maybe I could ask it of you, Rick Manning, how do we raise awareness about the true danger that this Chinese Communist Party regime represents to the United States, to the free world more generally, but specifically to this country, so as to at least hold very much accountable those who, as Brian has said, are actively enabling, mostly with other people's money, let's be clear, the kinds of threats that we're all talking about in the course of this program.
Frank, thanks for asking. I'm having a hard time doing this in the construct of a 501c3, but let me just do it in the way I can. There's a clear difference in terms of the perspectives of various candidates for office, and one of the people are paying attention right now to those perspectives. And so, if we right now over the next week or two bring out those perspectives and the comparison perspectives without necessarily advocating one or the other, just by recognizing those perspectives and bringing it to Americans' attention what those perspectives mean, I think we have a capacity to really dramatically increase knowledge. What's more, I think the national media is almost impossible to ignore some of the roles that China is playing in terms of their involvement with various politicians in America. And as a result, people are becoming more and more concerned about what China is doing. And so into this, we flow with really telling a story about the abuses that occurred, the people who've been victimized, and the real truth of it. I'll give you a simple example. This morning I was on the radio in Birmingham, Alabama, and it was all about China. And I was asked about what was happening in China, and I had about 2 minutes. And so I took the most important thing I could think of, and that is the forced organ harvesting that happens in China. And I explained what that meant very clearly in a short period of time. And the host literally said, "Whoa, that's horrible," and shocked him to the point where I'm back on tomorrow, talking, I guess on Thursday, talking about it. And that's what we have to do. We have to tell the truth, varnish truth. When Americans hear it, it rips away all the facade. It forces us to deal with what's real. And I think through the conservative talk radio network in particular, we have a real strong opportunity to drive this message to a large number of Americans, totally bypassing the establishment media that puts a blackout on.
Rick Manning, thank you. Your timing is perfect, as was the send-up for the next part of this program. I'm very pleased to introduce a man that has been an incredible blessing to the Committee on the Present Danger of China. There would be, I think it's fair to say, no Captive Nations coalition were it not for the very hard work of Se-Hun Kim, our campaign coordinator on this effort. He will take over at this point and introduce several of our contributors from Captive Nations that will help, we hope, add both detailed information concerning things like the forced organ harvesting, I call it organ genocide, that is a characteristic of the Chinese Communist Party. Se-Hun Kim, thank you for your leadership, and over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, everybody, for your time today. And thank you to everyone that's participating as part of our audiences. The time that we're facing at this point is a lot more important than a lot of people we would like to realize, but we are changing that slowly but surely. Today, I am privileged and honored to introduce members from each of the nations that either have been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party and are under a very great threat of being taken over by the CCP and getting their sovereignty taken away. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists that will be providing these information to everyone today regarding the works of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and what they have done to these captive nations for the past couple of decades. And let me also make something clear, is that the panelists that have participated today are actually really no different than all of us, except that they have stories and they have testimonies that I believe will be a game changer in the hearts of many that's out there. So without further ado, firstly, we will have Mr. Tenzin Sampo from the U.S. Tibet Committee to introduce us about the CCP's work in Tibet, which is something that has been known to us for many, many years now out in the West and really the rest of the world, especially through His Holiness, the work of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And after that, we will have Mr. Ilshad Hassan, who is the director of the China Affairs sector in the World Uyghur Congress. And Mr. Ilshad Hassan, let me also say that I have been a huge fan of his work for many years now. He has been an extremely well-known Uyghur scholar who was able to mentor many, many people throughout the years. Following that, we will have Mr. Inkibat Tokchok, who is the director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights and Information Center, And his work has been critical in introducing and to maintaining the exposure of the Southern Mongolian situation under the hands of the Chinese Communist Party for many years now. And it is our privilege and honor to have him here to talk to us about the erasure of the culture, the erasure of culture of the Southern Mongolians that's happening today. After that, we will have Dr. Sean Lin, who is the advisor to DOT Against War.
Sehun, maybe it would be best to just do a quick introduction before each of them speak, because this becomes a bit of a blur. So why don't we get started with three that you've already introduced, and then we'll pick up and introduce the next one. Say it, Sean Lin.
Sure. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Mr. Tenzin Sampo from the U.S. Tibet Committee. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Please unmute, Mr. Sampo.
Am I okay now? Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this important subject, and appreciate the opportunity. As you know, we know that Tibet was an independent country, but China occupied and illegally occupied in the last 61 years, since 1959. So when I talk about the Chinese threat, a lot of people in this country are unaware of what is really the Chinese threat, the communist or the socialist, or what kind of operations they do. For example, in Tibet, before they want to help the Tibetans, so-called liberate Tibet from the the old society, but in reality, the Tibetans have been subject to many unspeakable, sufferings and tortures and imprisonment, human suicide, cultural genocide. I mean, you name it, language, everything has been, taken away from them. And the Tibetan identity has been threatened in the last 61 years. And it's so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region, which is 1/3 of the Tibet, traditionally, is not, there's no any sign or even a symbol of autonomy. Every single policy, every single leaders, the Chinese handpicked and put there. And a lot of times, let alone it's autonomous, but it's harder than the general, in China. A lot of the actually Chinese, when they come to Tibet, and they get also shocked. So it looks like, cultural revolution. Young people when they were born in 80s and 90s, they do not know what is communism is. So I think we all know that Chinese government has been a threat, not for the Tibetans, but for the East Turkestan, the Mongolians, and the Tibetans, and now to the Hong Kong. What they want is they will try to sneak into, they want to do this, and try to be nice, but in reality, they have single object to destroy your culture, your identity, and make into a Han Chinese population. And that's never going to achieve, of course. No matter where you live in this world, when you are born as a human being, you have the right to speak, you have the right to exercise. And for me, luckily, I came out more than 6 years ago from Chinese occupation. And in the last 35 years, I have been speaking on behalf of the Tibetans who have no voice whatsoever, and they have been constantly under threat and monitored. We are not able to communicate. Tibetans were locked down, not just because of this COVID, but the Tibetans has been locked down ever since 1959, and very few Tibetans, even less than 1% Tibetans, they had a passport. Before 2012, those Chinese, they consider, as a no threat. So the Tibetans are not giving a passport to travel, or they say what they want. And since 2012, the Chinese government, because there was some kind of a lot of Tibetans went to in India to receive teachings of the Dalai Lama in India. Once they returned to Tibet, more than 2,000 Tibetans were